In this last video in the series, we're going to be talking about the Brainworks BX limiter True Peak. So this is the most current limiter that they've got in their catalog. And what they've done is they've taken their basic BX limiter and added onto it with some really great metering systems, and then also updated some of the features, such as adding some tone control and then a modern and classic twist on the limiter. So let's go through some of the parameters that are available on this plugin and then see what it can do. Starting off, you've got two modes. You've got modern and classic. So with classic, it's going to be less punchy, but when you use the modern mode, it's going to have a faster, more punchy attack and response with regards to the limiting of the incoming audio into the plugin. Then you've got your usual suspects on the limiter. We've got a gain where you can gain up to get some more volume from the audio. You can set the release time. Then you can also set the seeding threshold. So basically, you don't want anything to go over 0 dB, or if you maybe want to bring this down, maybe you're working with some more sort of streaming audio where you want a higher ceiling, then you can pull this up to maybe -1 dB. The XL, as you've seen in the other plugins, is a form of adding some warm saturation into the plugin. So we've got the benefit of adding that in and being able to activate it and turn it off. Then over here is the tone control. So here we can set a high pass filter, a low pass filter, and then set the foundation. So what this foundation does is it increases or decreases the foundation of the signal before hitting the limiter. So you can sort of fine tune the frequency response of your mix before you start any limiting. And when you adjust this, you're basically adjusting the overall tonality of the low end versus the treble. Higher values are going to give you more bass response, where putting it back, you're going to mix between the treble side of things. Then, like you saw in the BX limiter, you've got the channel link. So this links the stereo channel so that when it's fully 100%, both sides of the audio signal are being compressed and the threshold and gain are set with this, where if you pull this back, then it's processing them individually. By default, this is set to about 75%. You can mix in how much of this limiter you want to use. So maybe you're not using this within a mastering context, but you want to strap it across a bus within your mix, and you want to do some parallel processing. So you set a high limiter and then you mix it in with this percentage. And then, as you saw on the last video with the BX limiter, you've got this output dim. So you can set your threshold at 0 dB, but maybe you want to pull this back slightly. Specifically, if you're working with multiple tracks and you've got crossfades between the tracks, you don't want any clips between that crossfade section, so you can pull back this dim. Then on the low section over here, you've got your solo. So you can switch the left and right channels, and then you can also solo to here, just the left, the right, the mid, or the sides. And I will show you the solo in place when we play back the audio. Then over here is your meter. If you're not seeing this, you can just click this button here, or if you want to hide it, you can choose this. But as you see, it is quite a big meter and it's quite in depth and covers a lot of features. You can see the metering coming in with its RMS, true peak, and then also what happens on the output after the limiter with your true peak RMS. Then you've got your gain reduction, your dynamic range, and your LUFS, which is your perceived overall loudness of the audio. Also, you can choose how you want this meter to be displayed. It either can be short-term or momentarily. And then with your LUFS, there are different broadcast standards that you can use and different options and presets that you can use here. For example, if you go to louder, you can see the LUFS is going to be at -6. If you go for competitive, it's going to be at -10. If you go for the EU broadcast standard, it's at -23. And likewise, if you use, for example, the US broadcast, you can see there's different LUFS standards across the world. So you can use this as a broadcast standard, or maybe some of these other sort of determined options for LUFS values. I'm going to leave it set at competitive. So now let's hear this in action. I'm going to play back just before it gets to maybe the loudest part of the song, and we're going to adjust the gain and see what we can do with the tone control. And at the same time, we're going to look at the metering and the solo. So here we go. So here's the metering before. You can see my RMS and true peak. There's also the dynamic range and where it sits with perceived loudness. As you can see, it's pretty low. So now I'm going to jump over to the output, which is basically going to be exactly the same. And now let's increase the gain. So there's with 10 dB of extra gain. You can see the gain reduction, dynamic range, and where it sets with the perceived loudness. If I do push this up over 10 dB, you're going to hear how it's obviously going to push it too far. This gain can actually go to up to 24 dB. So there it's obviously distorting. So where it sounds really good is around about 8 dB of gain. If I just bypass this, you'll hear how much gain has actually been applied. And enabling it. So it's given us that extra volume, but it's still very transparent and clear. Now let's start that again, but this time I'm going to add in some of the XL saturation. Around about 50% is quite nice. This is without any limiting. And now with the extra gain and the saturation. You can also link the gain and the ceiling, so as I push it up, it's going to reduce the ceiling and increase the gain. Now onto the tone control. Let's move this foundation to hear how it adjusts that bass response of the foundation of the audio. Definitely getting more bass. So I want this to be more bass centered, so I'm going to set it around about 5. Then you can also set where you want your high pass frequency to be and your low pass frequency. These are really good default values. If you go below here, you might be having too much lows coming through into the master, but I think at 24 it's a good amount. And you can also cut back on this if you want to fine tune that tone control to maybe have a more centered area with less of the highs. And obviously these buttons allow you to deactivate these if you don't need them. Now let's go over to the solo section. I can switch the left and right. So let's switch the channels. I can solo the left. So now that left channel is going to be right in the center. This is the right. Now with solo in place, it's not going to take those separate sections and put them right in the middle. So if I say solo in place, there's the right on the right, and there's the left on the left. Then I can also hear just the mids, and then the sides. So just listening on what that limiter is doing as you increase that gain and all these other controls on the different sides and the stereo left and right. So that's a basic rundown of this True Peak limiter. So if you want a limiter with some advanced tone control and really good metering, then this is definitely the limiter to use within your mastering. And I think just to point out, if you weren't aware, True Peak limiters greatly limit the chance of any unexpected clipping. And under these different modes, the streaming one allows you to get the most optimum loudness for all the streaming platforms. Because obviously, this is the most common place now that music is being listened to. So you want to get the best loudness metering for these platforms. And as you can see, as we've gone through these videos, you've really got quite a selection of limiters. You can use the XLV2, which is a multi-band limiter taking into account the mids and the sides. So you've got control over how much limiting is being done on each of these bands. Then you've got the most basic version, which is the BX limiter, which is just a one-band limiter. Very simple, but you get some very clear, transparent results. And then with the True Peak limiter, it's a one-band limiter. We've got your tone control section and very good metering if you want very precise metering for your mastering. Overall, I think for my mastering chain for this song, I'm going to leave the BX Digital V3, the Dynamic EQ V2, and then the Pan EQ to correct that balancing of the mix, and then the BX limiter True Peak. So without any mastering that's been used in this mastering chain, we've got this for the track. And now with mastering chain that we built up. Obviously, let's have a look at the meters. So I'm just going to close those. This is the before and the after. So with no mastering, having a look at this meter over here. And then once everything is added, we've brought that audio right up. The overall RMS has been brought up, and you can see our dynamic range, our balancing, and correlation. So that's the dedicated mastering plugins that you can use from Brainworks. I hope that gives you a very good idea on how you can use the different metering systems and then the different types of processing that you can use within the steps of the mastering chain. For example, if you just want to get your masters done very quickly, there's the master desk that has everything included in one plugin. Or if you want more finer control, then you can go in using the Digital V3, the Dynamic EQ, and then your different limiter choices. So now that you've seen what the Brainworks plugins are capable of, now try these out in your own mix and see which ones work for you as you build up your mastering chain. So if you want to know more about mixing and mastering, definitely check out some of the other video series on Groove 3. And if you haven't seen my video series that goes over mixing with Brainworks, definitely check that out as well, because that covers some of the features that were briefly touched on in this video series. So now get in there and start trying out some of these plugins with your mastering.